The brothel. One of the oldest and most secretive businesses in the world. Clandestine activities protected at all costs. More than just dens of sin, brothels were key to the expansion of America's Wild West and the growth of modern cities.
Prostitution is one of the largest parts of New York's overall economy.
Brothels were a weapon of war.
The Nazi high command started looking at brothels as ways to gain intelligence.
Brothels broke down racial barriers. Uncover the truth behind the world of commercial sex. Brothels. New York. The city that never sleeps. Once home to the largest concentration of brothels in the United States. It was a multi-million-dollar business.
There was virtually no neighborhood in New York in the 19th century that did not have some prostitution.
Historian Timothy Guilfoyle is seeking the truth behind one of the most secretive and salacious businesses in the world.
We're standing here on Mercer Street in front of what is probably the last remaining mid-19th century brothel in New York. It was located primarily in what is today known as Soho.
This former brothel is now a private home. But in the 19th century, it was listed in this pocket-sized book, The Gentleman's Directory. Long before the internet, this was the insider's guide to the best brothels of 19th century New York.
Anywhere in the world and at any time where you have a greatly disparate sex ratio between men and women, you're going to have prostitution.
Houses where prostitutes ply their trade date back to the cradle of civilization. But during the 19th century, the brothel hit a pivotal era. Sex suddenly became big business in big cities like New York.
There's large numbers of single men that are migrating to the city. Sporting male culture develops that encourages, valorizes, you might say, male heterosexual indulgence. And so those forces, in many ways, combine to form a perfect storm to see this explosion in prostitution during the course of the 19th century.
Like any other business, brothels compete for customers. Many advertise special services, such as orgies and stripteases. Some even provide shows where women imitate naked classical Greek sculptures.
Guidebooks like The Gentleman's Directory were written very tongue-in-cheek. So, for example, Lizzie Goodrich's house has 5 good-looking lady boarders whose cheerful disposition tend to drive away the blues. There is a regular physician attached to the house, and every attention is shown to its visitors. So here's a doctor who can check for any kind of sexually transmitted disease.
The explosion of brothels contributes to the spread of venereal disease. So the Gentleman's Directory contains advertisements for French-imported male safes, an early version of condoms. They're made of sheep intestines and are reported to be extremely uncomfortable. By 1890, New York had over 1,000 brothels. High-class establishments charged between $10 and $15 a night. Prostitutes typically handed over half of their earnings to a madam. But being horizontally employed was better than many of the alternatives. In the 19th century, women had no legal right to property and were barred from most other jobs except hard, menial labor.
In the context of a 19th century immigrant whose only option is to work as a servant or to work in a factory for what may only be a few dollars a week, the attraction of working one night a week as a prostitute doesn't seem as far-fetched or as horrifying as it might be to some contemporaries.
Brothels were illegal in New York, but some police ignored the law and exploited the vice for their own profit.
Police officers knew where the brothels were located. They usually required some kind of payoff or bribe in order to let them operate without any kind of arrest happening. This was the standard practice in New York and most cities.
At the time, the temperance movement and other reform campaigns put pressure on politicians to crack down on drunkenness and bad behavior. 1896, the Raines Law restricted the sale of alcohol on Sundays to only hotels. The law, intended to curb drinking, unintentionally boosted the brothel business.
We're standing in front of Sheffel Hall in New York, and this is one of the few remaining Raines Law hotels still standing in New York. The definition of a hotel was 10 beds or more. So almost immediately, saloons, such as Sheffel Hall here, were transformed into hotels officially by adding 10 beds to their upper floors.
The saloon owners realized that they could make money from their new beds by renting them out to prostitutes. The Raines Law hotels became fronts for brothels, secretly selling sex and liquor hand in hand. But the explosion in brothels didn't stay underground for very long. 1905. A civic group called the Committee of 14 demanded a large-scale investigation into the Raines Law hotels.
Civic leaders hired investigators to identify what establishments were promoting prostitution. And you can actually go down to the New York Public Library, and the papers are there with lists of hotels and saloons that were designated as promoting prostitution.
The secret world of commercial sex transformed New York City. In 1859 alone, it generated nearly $6 million, more than the shipping and brewing industries combined. Brothels were one of the largest contributors to the city's economy. They not only provided sex, they also stimulated other forms of entertainment, revolutionizing the city's cultural identity.
Commercial sex exemplifies this new underground economy that many immigrant working-class New Yorkers would have thrived in. Related to that is also the new kind of leisure culture that emerges around theaters, saloons, concert halls, which are integrated into the networks of brothels that are oftentimes located just outside their doors.
New York's brothels were big business, and the business rapidly expanded to other big cities.
As a politician down in Louisiana once said, you can make prostitution illegal, but you can't make it unpopular. This is what men will do, provided the opportunity.
1897, Louisiana. New Orleans, nicknamed the Big Easy, became the first American city to decriminalize prostitution. But only in a 16-square-block area near the French Quarter called Storyville.
A number of politicians on the city council in New Orleans decided, well, we can't entirely stop it. So the idea was to regulate it, license it, and restrict it, and thereby control the vice and the crime and everything that went with it.
Almost overnight, Storyville became an international sensation, home to over 250 brothels and 2,000 prostitutes. from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds. Unlike other American brothels, Storyville's houses of disrepute introduced the notion of racial integration.
Storyville is controversial because it doesn't subscribe to the Jim Crow laws that were typical of southern cities at the turn of the 20th century. So you have racial interaction in many of the houses of prostitution.
In Storyville, white and black bordellos coexisted. Sex across the color line was common, but only for white men and black prostitutes.
Storyville not only had white prostitutes in white brothels to service whites, a few blacks worked as prostitutes in those brothels as well, but black males were restricted to the black brothels.
The Blue Book was a secret guide to Storyville's brothels. Some were mansions decorated in erotic opulence, like Lulu White's Mahogany Hall, with its mirrored ceiling and walls.
In Lulu White's Blue Book description, her brothel said the only place in town in New Orleans where you can get 3 shots, the shot upstairs, the shot downstairs, and the shot in the room.
Storyville's racial mix changed the history of American music. A number of top jazz performers of the early 20th century got their start in the red light district. And for the first time, white Americans were exposed to black music.
Because of racial segregation and because of the controversial nature of jazz and its early history, in many ways, Storyville gives birth to jazz. And some of the earliest jazz musicians get their start in Storyville.
A young Louis Armstrong even earned money by delivering coal to the bordellos.
Jazz did thrive there, especially jazz pianists, because often these brothels had just enough money to hire one musician, and that was a piano player.
Brothels played a prominent role in the development of urban America and were key to America's expansion into the Wild West. "150 years ago, brothels were big business in America's cities. But there was also growing demand in the Wild West. Between 1807 and 1912, hundreds of thousands of men headed west, looking to work as miners, cowboys, and railroad workers. Places like Deadwood and Dodge City sprung up almost overnight. But the jobs were backbreaking and the living conditions were harsh. The secret to making the men happy in these boomtowns was the saloon and brothel. But not necessarily in that order.
Frontiersmen, miners, prospectors, all of these kinds of activities. They're young, they're vigorous, they're healthy, they're adventurous. Well, they need women. And if women are not there, respectable women they can date and marry, then that vacuum will be filled by prostitutes.
Immigrant and working-class women of all races flocked to the West to become prostitutes. Although brothels were legal in most frontier towns, the business was far from respectable. Newspapers discreetly referred to the women as soiled doves, fallen angels, or sporting women. So prostitutes and madams go by aliases like Chicago Joe, Squirrel Tooth Alice, and Madame Mustache.
Popular culture gives us this idea that brothels and prostitution in the Old West was all kind of out in the wide open. Because it was legal, it was just sort of accepted, and that's not always the case. It was very much looked down upon.
You wouldn't necessarily talk about it out loud, except for, amongst your friends. Was it secretive? Yeah, secretive as much as a secret of an elephant in the closet. Everybody knew it was there.
In the 1890s, Butte, Montana, was the copper mining capital of the United States. It was also home to some of the most notorious brothels of the Wild West.
On a Saturday night when the men received their paychecks, they say there were about 4,000 men that came through this area. Many people claim that at any given time, at least 1,000 women were working in this block.
Dumas House was one of Butte's famous brothels. The Victorian Den of Vice kept its doors open from 1890 to 1982, the longest running house of prostitution in the history of America. Within the walls are secret clues about its days of decadence and deviance.
The Dumas is, first of all, unique because its upper floor is preserved exactly as it was when Copper Kings would come here and spend $1,000 in an evening. The women would pair off with the men and they would retire to the upstairs after these grand balls.
Your main floor here at the Dumas brothel, that was your regular run-of-the-mill folks. And upstairs, I guess you could say your more posh rooms, your more expensive shopping.
The prostitutes had secret tricks to make themselves more appealing.
Prostitutes used a number of cosmetics. Sometimes the ingredients included lead and mercury to thicken their eyelashes. They also would put drops of whiskey in their eyes or soapy water. It would sting, but it caused the eyes to tear and give them a sparkle. But they also used complexion wafers. Complexion wafers included, among their ingredients, arsenic. And what this arsenic would do was kill red blood cells and give beautiful, smooth, milky, white skin. Because the last thing they wanted to look like was some sunburnt ranch hand.
The most desirable prostitutes entertained the copper barons in the spacious upstairs parlors. The older prostitutes serviced the common miners in cramped basement rooms known as cribs.
This is the basement of the Dumas, where there's a series of cribs where women worked in shifts corresponding with the miners' shifts in the mines. The women would sit in the doorways and in the windows, and they would solicit and they would display their wares, and they would tap with chopsticks, with rings, or with thimbles to try to attract attention. Unlike the rooms upstairs, these rooms were not equipped with corner sinks. They had no plumbing, and so the women were forced to use basins to clean themselves.
Each room was equipped with a doorbell that could be used as a secret code system.
One ring might mean that the woman was ready for the next customer. 2 rings might mean that she needed drinks delivered to the downstairs. Or 3 rings might mean that she was in trouble. And basically, these doorbells were a safeguard so that if there were violence on the part of the customer, she might be able to better summon help.
Robbery was rampant both in and around brothels, so prostitutes didn't accept cash. They used other currency substitutes that could be redeemed at saloons or general stores.
The Dumas has yielded up some interesting artifacts, including one piece of scrip, which is fake money so that they didn't have to handle the cash, and it was much safer for the women. Another interesting artifact is this timer that was found. Men would purchase time, and they would use hourglasses in order to count the minutes.
The Dumas brothel boasted that if needed, it could provide clients with a secret means of escape.
Many times, someone had to get in or get out. Could be the police, could be someone's wife looking for them. And they always had that opportunity to leave, and there were always passages to do so. Here at the Dumas, in this room, for example, actually built right into the wall was an escape hatch, large enough for a man to crawl through.
There were other escape routes. Butte had a network of underground tunnels that once transported steam heat to buildings throughout the city. But men used the subterranean system to come and go from brothels without ever being seen.
At the end of the hallway here is the entrance to the tunnels. We've all heard legends about how this was connected to City Hall, and certain customers who didn't want to be seen could enter the Dumas through the tunnel system.
Some of the best-kept secrets were medicinal. Venereal disease was a constant problem. Medical remedies used to treat or prevent gonorrhea and syphilis include arsenic, mercury, and vinegar.
They would use all kinds of very harsh chemicals. Sometimes they would make the man wash with the chemicals before they would engage in any kind of intercourse.
As more families moved west, frontier towns became more civilized. Brothels were restricted to specific areas called red light districts. Western folklore claims the term came from the railroad workers who left their red lanterns on the front porches of the brothels. Butte's red light district, known as Venus Alley, was told to be even more discreet.
There was a city ordinance that was passed that the women had to pull their blinds down so that they couldn't solicit out their windows. And so the solution finally was to cut doors and windows into the back of those businesses, cribs and parlor houses. And that way the women could solicit in the alleyways in the back.
Like many red light districts, Venus Alley had dark secrets. Here, space was so tight that the brothels went underground, literally.
When that area was raised in the 1980s, beneath that area, the city found hundreds of little tiny cribs that were carved out of bedrock, where women worked underground, much like the miners worked underground, and probably under conditions that were just as terrible.
The madams and prostitutes typically didn't leave a paper trail, so the actual number of sex workers remains a mystery. However, another secret war on brothels forces the business even further underground. Brothels, not simply dens of vice. In 19th century America, they fueled economic growth in urban cities and helped expand the western frontier. Their contributions went largely unnoticed. The industry remained part of an underworld society, an environment of gambling, drinking, and lawlessness.
The idea of prostitution is really part and parcel of the taming of the West. It was a very important industry. Those women performed an important service to the men, not only just sexual services, but those very early prostitutes took care of the men. And had it not been for those women, they might not have gone to a barber, they might not have taken a Saturday night bath.
In frontier towns, prostitutes lived in obscurity. However, evidence of their existence can be found by reading between the lines of an official document, the US Census.
What I found hidden in the US Census records throughout the West are the secrets of brothels. I looked at every single page of the census of 1900 for the town of Bisbee, and I didn't find any prostitutes. What I did find, however, are secret operations going on. In this case, we have a 22-year-old Sonoran-born saloon keeper. He's listed as the head of household. Living under the same roof are 3 women in their 20s. They're just listed as boarders or lodgers. Given they're living under the roof of a saloon keeper, and given that saloons often doubled as brothels in the Old West, there's a high likelihood that these 3 women are prostitutes.
The stigma of prostitution kept brothels in the shadows. And the shadows are where outlaws like to hide. In San Antonio, Fanny Porter's brothel was a frequent hideaway for Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch.
Prostitutes and brothel madams very much appreciated outlaws because they knew they were generous tippers. And as a result of that, these prostitutes protected them.
Criminal elements gravitated to brothels, and the law was often close behind. The madams often resorted to blackmail to protect their business.
The madams and the brothels took advantage of the legal system where they could, via blackmail. And I think that the legal system definitely took advantage of their position as well. Intimidation, payouts, buy-offs. I think it's easy to say that they would scratch each other's back, or something similar to that.
Occasionally, prostitutes needed to hide from the police and the public. A French prostitute named Sandra, who was smuggled in illegally from Canada, devised her own secret hideaway.
Her best-kept secret was how she never got arrested. And for years, people tried to figure out why. It wasn't that she'd vanish into thin air like they thought. She vanished into the refrigerator. This was a refrigerator with a broken handle on the outside. However, when you opened it, you simply saw that it was hollowed out. She would crawl inside of it, not being a very large woman herself, and would simply lock herself in.
The brothel business was physically and emotionally demanding. Many women didn't last long. The average career was less than 5 years. Some chose an early retirement.
You can only imagine some of the pain these prostitutes went through in their lives. I mean, they had to have faced, in many cases, a point where they had no other options out. One of the bottles that they had found here at the Dumas actually contained some strychnine, used numerous times to commit suicide. When they couldn't take it anymore,
brothels prospered for nearly a century. But when America joined World War I, the industry came under attack. The US military feared the spread of venereal disease among soldiers training near port cities. In 1917, a commission outlawed all red light districts in the United States. In an instant, the brothel boom went bust. But when American troops landed in Europe, new opportunities arose. The French army even set up field brothels for Allied soldiers near the Western Front.
Anywhere, at any time in history, from biblical era to modern days, prostitution will always thrive when you set up these kinds of conditions. During the Civil War, because of the many camp followers for Joe Hooker's troops, they became known as hookers, servicing Hooker's soldiers there in the Civil War.
Certainly, people's morals and feelings regarding brothels and prostitution tend to be a little bit different during times of war than times of peace. So there's an acceptance of the brothel and of prostitution, and it's a little bit different than maybe they would have felt back home.
At the outbreak of World War II, the American government tried to stem the popularity of brothels amongst its troops. Congress gave the military the authority to blitz brothels near military bases. However, US commanders turned a blind eye to what they felt was a necessary evil. At the time, Hawaii was an American territory, not yet a state. Here, the laws against prostitution were less strict. When 1 million American soldiers passed through Hawaii's capital, Honolulu, on their way to the Pacific, the brothel business exploded.
The Navy especially saw this as being kind of beneficial, so did the Army. The Honolulu Police Department then decided to heavily regulate prostitution in the city.
Every payday, the servicemen stood in long lines in Honolulu's red light district to pay $3 to spend 3 minutes with a prostitute.
If he couldn't perform, he would get, in some cases, what was called a rain check. And the girl would literally give him permission to come back some other time when he was in a better condition and try again.
Proof of the US military's tolerance of brothels can be found in these leaflets. They list prophylactic stations where servicemen can pick up condoms or be counseled by VD control officers.
Among the records that I brought is an original US Army brochure that basically would be issued to troops at prophylactic stations. It is a brochure called Sex Hygiene and Venereal Disease. It was published by the War Department. It says so right on the cover.
While the police and the US military regulate Honolulu's red light district, the Nazis discover that brothels can be used as a secret weapon of war. Brothels leave a memorable imprint on the fabric of American society throughout the 19th and early 20th century. Even in wartime, prostitution is a booming business on both sides of the battlefield. During World War II, the Nazis seize and regulate at least 22 brothels in France. In Paris, Hermann Göring and other high-ranking commanders of the Third Reich are regulars at exclusive high-class bordellos called closed houses. While most of the country suffers under Nazi oppression, the French prostitutes reap the financial rewards of sleeping with the enemy. This horizontal collaboration continues throughout the war.
There were various views regarding its legitimacy. This is a dirty little secret about the war. The brothels of France actually flourished under Nazi occupation. The brothel madams were happy to keep their doors open and make lots of money.
At the outbreak of the war, the Nazis realized that brothels can have secondary benefits.
Foreign businessmen, politicians, prominent people within Germany, within the structure of the Third Reich, they would visit these places. So they started looking at these brothels as ways to gain intelligence.
In 1939, the Nazis took over a bordello in Berlin for espionage activities. The plan for this clandestine operation was hatched when Kitty Schmidt, madam of a high-class brothel in a wealthy neighborhood of Berlin, was arrested. Ever since the Nazis came into power, fleeing refugees helped Kitty transfer her money to British banks. When she tried to escape the country herself, the Nazis arrested her. Kitty was given an ultimatum: become a spy or be sent to a concentration camp.
The Nazi intelligence officers, under the command of Reinhard Heydrich, who was a senior member of the Waffen-SS and a future architect of the Holocaust, offered her a deal. And the deal was this: that you will come back to Berlin, you will operate this brothel for us. So they basically made Kitty Schmidt an offer she couldn't refuse. Meanwhile, the city police in Berlin had been arresting prostitutes, and they pulled together a group of about 20 or so women, and they selected them to be sort of the main employees of Kitty Schmidt's brothel.
The brothel was called Salon Kitty. It was wired with concealed microphones that ran down to a cellar equipped with recording devices. The purpose was to monitor intimate conversations of possible traitors within the Nazi regime.
Every word spoken in Salon Kitty would be recorded. The Nazis wanted to know when a high-ranking member of the SS or of the German government or one of their allies like Italy, if they have anything bad to say about Hitler.
Among the 25,000 recordings were those of Count Galeazzo Ciano, the foreign minister of Italy. He spoke unfavorably about Hitler. Ciano was eventually executed for treason in Italy. Reinhard Heydrich, the high-ranking Nazi officer, even made so-called inspection tours of the brothel. But the microphones were turned off during his visits. In 1942, British intelligence officer Roger Wilson, disguised as a Romanian press secretary, went undercover in the brothel. He sets up his own wiretap and eavesdrops on the same conversations as the Nazis.
It was sort of a successful counter-espionage operation by the British at Salon Kitty. Eventually, this intelligence officer was apprehended by the Nazis, and he spent a considerable amount of the war in a concentration camp.
The Nazis ended the spy program within a year. They allow Kitty Schmidt to maintain her business while threatening her to remain silent about the espionage activities. The sex tapes were allegedly lost during the war.
The Nazi powers that be must have made a pretty serious impression on Kitty Schmidt, because she did not speak about what went on at Salon Kitty during those war years, even after the war.
Throughout history, brothels maintain a constant presence. While they often exist on the fringes of civilization, the origin of the sex industry has been found in a shocking place. Ancient texts and archaeological remains indicate that brothels were established by one of the earliest and most sacred institutions: religion.
The big secret behind brothels, I think, is that they were started under the aegis of religion, and the prostitutes were seen as something to be taken and revered, as opposed to shunned, as they are today often.
The earliest record of a brothel traces back to ancient Mesopotamia, around 2300 BC. Sumerian texts mention a temple bordello where prostitutes perform sex rites dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility.
Prostitution seems to have centered around the temples. What we find in these early civilizations is that there's a strong association between religion and sexuality.
On a hilltop in the ancient Greek city of Corinth, the temple of Aphrodite once employed 1,000 female servants, or hetaira, who performed sex as a ritual to the goddess of love. But did the sacred whores offer sinful pleasures at the temple or elsewhere? Archaeologists think that these servants may also have provided sex in tavern-like dwellings.
Archaeologists have debated about what defines a brothel. But we do have buildings that seem to have some small rooms where a prostitute might service a customer. And so I think what happened was that the prostitutes were owned by the temple, but they would have worked in brothels or taverns down below.
The relationship between brothels and religion continues in ancient Rome and remains there for well over 1,000 years. The secret world of brothels has evolved over time. In the 21st century, prostitution is still decriminalized and regulated in many parts of the world.
But the need for them has, I think, substantially dropped. But there is, of course, still the appeal of the secretive tryst, which is something that's easily done at a brothel as opposed to just sort of out in the open. So it's inherently secretive.
While they still maintain a steady business in some parts of the globe, brothels now compete with other forms of commercialized sex.
The brothel never completely goes out of existence, but its dominance declines dramatically after 1896 and into the 21st century. Prostitution becomes organized more around escort services and call girl services.
In the United States, brothels are illegal, except for Nevada, where state laws allow for prostitution in any county with a population under 400,000. However, outside of Nevada, the business continues underground. Massage parlors, spas, and tanning salons are often secret fronts for commercial prostitution.
There are a number of locations that oftentimes are fronts for prostitution rings. The internet, of course, has proved wildly revolutionary in how we deal with sex, offering meetup times or locations, kind of ad hoc brothels.
Despite their controversial nature, brothels have endured over time, transcending laws, social mores, and cultures. At times, they've stimulated economies, boosted wartime morale, and even fostered interracial interaction. For better or worse, brothels help to shape the world we live in.